What was in Fordland? Well, in the middle of nowhere in Fordland was where a castle was. This place had like no shade outside, and it was designed to be a programming theater like setting, like 1700s time gate opened up there. And this group of people had an obsession with treasure buried there and the 1700s for some reason. So Pink Panther was encoded to this place, and encoded to me along with Little House on the Prairie, which I'll get into next. Um, Down from this castle was a spring, and then a place called Panther Creek. And this group had set up a Tesla tower in the field somehow. It was 45 minutes out of town, in the middle of nowhere, and it was hidden in this like perception gap, so people thought it was part of a telephone wire pole when they drove past on this dirt road. And a lot of really hardcore physical endurance tests were done out here, and a lot of mind-numbing, gruesome games where you thought that you would thirst to death out there in the middle of summer in the heat and other things, and try to shift reality out there against the Tesla coil and the experiments that were being done in this field, because it was like you were also running through time waves and then collapse them in a quantum game, which went all over the world. There's places that were set up like that. So the spring there also dried up for some reason, and there was a panther out there. There was panther hunts, a road called Blackfoot, and other events that happened there due to what popped out behind this Tesla coil when it ramped up in the field. And I remember going into this field and creek and seeing Hasatan himself transformed into a stalking panther once and shapeshift down the stream. So we had a lot of crazy water area experiences in places out in the middle of nowhere. Another lake area was where a Japanese hybrid goat-eyed snake-like man threw castbolt off a cliff. And this was an ancient process with this gnarly forest. And there was a black snake in the water there that got trapped and lodged itself between the cleft of some long rocks. When time was shifted out there, and it actually got squeezed to death out there, and it had been terrorizing this creek bed, which is totally dry now due to the defilement of nature that happened in this place and the habitat invasion and orange reptilian warfare that went on there and all the residue that was left behind. So we had to trap ancient things sometimes too. And this thing got stuck between the rock hole as time been shifted, and then the snake was crushed to death. And its monstrous form kind of shrunk down into the size of a tadpole in a black pool of water at the end in the mouth of the small spring entrance. Because this ancient snake had defiled the spring where it nested in the area, and then the whole spring dried up and turned into a cave-like pool of black water. And we actually got a picture of this jagged-toothed creature in the water that we called the snaggletooth lake monster, and we gave it to the conservation department after the mission there, and then they denied it, of course, and called it debunked to the public. So some places were long drawn-out ancient battle areas contesting land ownership and claims. Some of these places were like enchanted forest-looking places, like this one that ended up with a snake pit. This we called Nuclear Lake, too, the Simpsons Lake. This is where the bushes sent out hordes of Dracos underneath the lake tunnel through the storm sewer opening at night, which was another stormtrooper's file. And we were on mission to rid the snake and other lake things that had hatched over time there. And these missions were very hard because it wasn't like you were just on a regular mission, because it was always like you're going through time waves on the water or something complex and complicated along with it. And one day we saw this like large blown up yellow piece of plastic over the lily pads, and then we drove closer and realized it was an innocent man who had been killed by this black lake snake during our mission when time shifted and other things, and time windows open and close at certain intervals and things. So it can get very strange. And he was an older man who had a yellow rain poncho on that actually had puffed up on the water from being there too long. So then that body was pulled behind the boat and brought to shore as the mission closed because it was time constrained and it involved time wave running, as interdimensionals use waveforms to manifest and unmanifest sometimes. So you have these quantum windows that open and close. So we had to be quick and utilize the quantum realm to have success. And then the police later took that body, and the lake eventually got cleared of all the supernatural crypto stuff and phenomena that was just incessant there for a while. And down from the middle of the lake were these little island chains, and these back channel islands ended in these coves, and that used some high-tech frequency weapons, which ended up a little war there to get rid of the orange reptilians that were there, and in the forest long grass. And so then there was dead reptilians all over the island in the water, and they were high-tech hydro energy weapons that was used against them. So there was these secret war lakes that went on, and a total of 3 in the area, which are completely non-swimmable still for several reasons. And we called the island war the Snake Island Nuclear Lake 007 Apophis file, and this is near the tail's end, which is another giant burial ground. And the Bushes were involved with a lot of these lake events and utilized a nuclear facility nearby to create bodies and propagate them out and bury things like giants and other ancient things. So down the road from here were drone club members in a special access house that were documenting all events and files from public perception. And across from this little stone house, fenced off corner, was a parcel of land. And this is where the children that were abducted or raised to be sacrificed were brought through this large black iron gate on an old stone post down a really windy, long black top road. And at the end of this was a field, an empty field, and a really big, evil queen bird looking tree. And the house that was there as a holding cell was cloaked. The mission ended here as we stood in this sacred evil queen bird grove setting that looked like a patch of farmland and weird stone posts marking the perimeters. And they used this humongous, grotesque looking evil tree to give blood to and sacrifices over time to prepare it for bigger events, and the strange fire burning in front of it. And this is paying homage to the fallen bird, like fallen angels that look like Skeksis, like the first class of them that are supposed to be the most powerful or something. As the fires burned and the black smoke rose and clouds manifested, spirits in this like eerie silence, these black streaks were also on the grass and driveway from the fights that happened there. And the evil queen bird that was black with black eyes was screeching as she manifested through the tree, because they used trees as portals that had been prepared for her to come through. So this happens with trees, like sacred altars were fashioned from seeds back in biblical times, like the Asherah poles, which was a square block dedicated from a tree from its seed and had to be fashioned a certain way, and wine libations poured out of it onto it. And orgies and all this stuff that goes along with true idolatry and worship, and it has nothing to do with the Christmas tree. So this queen bird would manifest inside of the tree and spread her wings out as she received the sacrifices that this tree had accumulated over time, and she was really terrifying and hyenas looking, and when they had bloodthirsty eyes, and when they were about to present another victim to her, her claws would come out that reached out from the tree limbs, and then our team members were ready in the air in a sky plane, like a helicopter, but it was way more advanced than a helicopter, and then shot down fire like lasers that burned up the tree with quick fire lasers and any other abominable structure there that took out. So what was left there was this charred, petrified looking, melted, gigantic queen bird, skeleton tree, and these black circles and pieces of driveway that had been smashed, and they had stains and evidence all over it. And the remaining Bush loyalists actually started trying to drag us down the driveway by our hair, but our extraction moment happened right then. So the front gate remains like really bent and busted, and the perimeter totally is overgrown with vines and black thorns, and it's like twisted, tortured trees are just all over the area, encircling it. So no more children were ever brought there again. These ancient ritual sites were part of the Pedivore Wars, and those sites shut down, and the place was put on surveillance. So if anyone ever tried to go back and start up this ancient power site again, it would immediately be shut down, because they cannot gain the stronghold that they used to. They don't have as much power as they used to when they used to get away with more of this stuff, because it's just on such watch now. And there's so many guardians that are aware and watching and pointing out these places. There was another mouth and gate of hell. This, to me, was another mouth and gate of hell that had to be shut down, and it was necessary in order to preserve that piece of the city and break that stronghold, and then deal with the repercussions quietly of the intertwined satanic invasions and sinister forces that tried to break angelic gates and pillars that the Lord Almighty had laid in certain places and cities hundreds of years ago, and to restore that. So another example of this is the Ingalls Wilder clan that was also near here. And Ma Wilder was like this 4-foot green-eyed witch bitch dragon lady that had some kind of a matriarchal keepsake dragon lady thing, like this dead thing, in their basement at the Rocky Ridge house in Mansfield, Missouri. And the only way I can describe these dragon ladies' malevolence is when their eyes manifest. It is like stone green red fire eyes that just look at you. It's just pure evil. And the house at Rocky Ridge had doors that were like dungeon doors, and kids were thrown into the basement. They had actually had like prison chains, balls and chains that you would hook to the ankles and stuff. And there were large vents on the bedroom floors that were access areas to the basement, and that creature that was down there and the thick stagnation that seeped up through the bedrooms came from that. Not to mention the noises that came from down in the basement. So I can't even imagine what those kids went through living there. And this house had cut out altar corners in it where they had candles lit, and a lot of ritual stuff was done there. So this line, the Wilder Ingalls line, was connected to the Hortons line, who blinded children via the use of Black Sun sorcery and kept them to do SRA rituals with them out in the middle of nowhere. So we were sent in on ops to break that ritual ground and the rings and sites and connection points. And the Wilders were replaced with clones eventually, and that matriarchal dragon line was buried for good. She was actually clobbered to death with stones, and that were infused with an ancient energy weapon. And this was the last of her kind. And this also goes back to the 14th century and 14 dragon lines and the Council of the Spear, and an energy weapon that was a spear that was used to actually kill dragon-like type beings from that bloodline, and giants. So energy weapons weren't just technologically created, they were also ancient artifacts that were used to follow and track certain lines. So the inside of the Wilder house was painted like a putrid green color, and it reeked of this dragon energy. And they had these big king and queen chairs that were huge for their leaders to sit onto. And I eventually escaped the Rocky Ridge home by night once, because it was lit up with satanic candles inside this wall nooks, and then I avoided a satanic marriage that was being prepared by the matriarchal queen who was there, already sitting in that throne chair waiting for me in the living room by the time that I got there. So Ma Wilder was this green-eyed, red fire-eyed little wicked dragon lady who used this kitchen divider to cover up what she was cooking and feeding to the family and children and the visitors. And then one time alone with her, she'd actually open up the slat that was this island room separator and manifest her green bulging eyes and her plate of flesh food. So Rose Wilder was replaced with the clone too that everyone thought was off traveling the world. And the back bathroom once had the looking glass, and it was just a handheld mirror device at one point, and they would keep kids in the bathroom for hours until they had looked in the mirror and said something in the mirror, and they used that black sun to blind the children. And what you would see in this mirror was a demonic black and white dog inside of it with a black patch around its eye that you'd see reflecting inside of the mirror. Kind of like Spud McKenzie, that type of dog, but necrotic and freaky looking. And he looked very dead, and he came to the mirror portal surface. And when he did that, you wouldn't see his true form right away. And they would try to program the kids into interacting and interfacing with this dog spirit. And then if they didn't see the spiritual form that was in them, that mirror, this dog spirit would come out and bite the child's eye, taking your spiritual eye through the mirror. And so what happened with this dog and this techniques that they used was I trapped him inside of the mirror as the mirror split and cracked. And then the actual dog manifested outside in the backyard that they also used to lure children into the looking glass mirror with. And then he was buried outside right with the other victims that the Ingalls Wilder Weaver cult had taken. So it was a big weaver web. And the Masonic items and cursed button heart pillows that they have in the museums, those are all very cursed objects. And Alonzo was a Mason going to the Weaver Masonic lodges. And what that button heart pillow represented was a collection of eyes that were taken from the blind children, just like the Coraline button scarecrow eyes, as I've mentioned in other files too. So my great-grandmother was named Coraline, and I also had experiences, so that's really my file too. In places like this that had actual monsters in their basements and so much quantum holes punched in them, and warfare are still under surveillance and scanned regularly. So during this type of special access programs, we were moved around like chess pieces sometimes, mainly by CIA, and you couldn't like touch doorknobs or anything in certain places until everything was recalibrated, and you were recalibrated each time, and the tech cleared, and each space fully, in all time and spaces, was fully grounded and anchored back and set to where they specifically and exactly wanted it to be. So you had to just completely stay still sometimes, go through certain quantum decontamination protocols, and you couldn't touch anything, or anyone couldn't touch you for a while until you're totally cleared. And things were neutral. So quantum protocols are much more intricate than regular ops that are just static in one point in time. One other area was down from James River, and there was this bend in the river where there was a little side cove that had a large concrete green stone wall in the middle of nowhere. And it didn't match the topography because the rest of the river was just these dirt banks, hanging branches, natural structures. So right before this was this trap zone that had evil ancient foundations laid there, and where the plans of the enemy were thwarted in a huge way that ended up changing the whole city. So, and I've spoken in other books about a pale, ugly drag queen fallen angel called Pax, for short. And this is usually a title, like Rex would be a title for a rank or order, or abbreviation for a race or class of beings. So I'll just say Fallen Angel Pax. He set up shop in this creek bend on Crichton's land, like an encroaching plan that had hatched from hell that started up hundreds of years ago. Now, there's signs that say private property and warning signs, and they're scattered throughout. But at that time, we shut the operation down because the land was being used on both sides by Masons, and they were on board with this and well aware of the dealings that went on both sides of the river, and they used others to bring victims to that area day and night. So there would be fires set on both sides of the river as parties stood across from the banks, and then they watched the activities and formed like an accumulation, a crescendo of a spiritual evil bridge across from the banks to each other, and trading and whatever else went on in this area. This huge cement platform. It was like in the shape of a triangle, and it just kind of jutted out onto the riverbank. But we saw some really crazy things happen out there, and reality shift, and that piece of concrete elongate and get smashed too. So the gathering place was a very secretive place. It was used before a road was actually made to access this part of the river publicly, which was before 1901. And the arm of the Secret Space Program and NSA and ONI that knew what was happening here sent in operatives undercover, and it was some kids that got sent there. So I was sent there, taken by boat at dusk to this spot, and then stopped at the cove where the large, tall green wall was. And this spiritual green is always a putrid spiritual filth in these places, and it's a residue. It's like Egyptian crocodile, gross, slimy residue that's worse than mold. You don't want to touch this stuff. It's like black goo, but it's green. And these green doors of silence we were used to throughout different places in the world where these networks were set up. There was just like so many green walls, so many green doors, and all things were documented and filed as a green door military patch because of this. And many operatives and soldiers forgot about all the green doors too. So I was lifted up by a man off the boat, and then I looked up trying to mask my signature into the eyes, because I did not want to look into the eyes of this black-eyed giant albino drag queen, sharp-featured fallen angel's face. So Pax ended up reaching down and trying to grab my hand, and was pulling up children with his hands to the top of this wall. And then most had been drugged, so they were a bit listless, and they didn't really kick or fight much, but they were, or they were just fear-stricken, as you could see in their face and their body movements. So when his hand touched mine, immediately fear and panic struck me as I tried to hide back into myself and gain the courage to complete this mission. But it was scary as hell. And his hand was like whitish, but up close it had these long black nails, and it smelled and was like moving almost and writhing with some green, light green color underneath the skin that was moving under his skin for some reason. So when they touch places, this like green Luciferian essence infects whatever it touches, and then the walls of places over time eventually turn like a putrid or slimy green color and then grow black mold. So the kids would be picked up by his hand, taken to the fire circle, and they were standing on this large triangle-shaped concrete slab over the water. And this was an ancient Egyptian dedicated ritual site that looked ancient, like it had come straight out of like a Mayan or Aztec temple in origin. It's like they moved it in time or something, energy-wise. So we called this area the Green Trading Wall. And many trades were done here and in the fields by these riverbanks. So as we stood on the Egyptian ritual corner, many strange things started happening, like Inception. They tried to make a bridge move across the river or elongate the physical matter of the concrete, and we saw angelic warfare there. We saw reality shift, dimensional shifts with the portals in this place. The things that were spoken, the rituals that were done, the rites. We saw several different time periods of how they were trying to accumulate and get this place taken off, to make it like a pyramid or a Mayan temple. I don't remember what the exact purpose was, but they wanted it to be a pretty big site. And it became a war to claim dominion over this stronghold, because nobody knew it was back here by the river. And victims, kids would go missing. They never thought it was like 10 miles down on a river. Victims walked to the edges of this concrete like they were walking a plank, and then Pax and his followers would do anything for him. These Masons, like, they loved this disgusting albino drag queen looking guy. So he was about 9 feet tall. He was also called the Yellow King. And they had other different creek sites and places where they would summon the Yellow King. So they'd do anything for him. They worshipped him. They thought he was beautiful, but really he was just a bloodthirsty 9 to 12 foot yellow-robed Yellow King from hell. And he was just full of vanity and pride. So the fire pit would rage, and then he would eat his victims, throwing them up in the air, while trucks were on both sides of the river. So if any victims or children or older victims decided to run, the Mason Yellow King cult followers would chase them down with trucks, or just chase them down. And as this rage went on, you'd see the strange fires burn, and the victims would be thrown off the concrete slab and underneath these two huge ancient-looking trees that were uprooted, and they had their huge roots exposed to come out facing the fire from the water. So they were above the water's surface. And then out of those, because trees are used as portals, would come two monstrous creatures out. So these two trees had been prepared for this site a long time ago, positioned for that, for the offering. And then what happens is that the trunks became portals and were used as portals for beings to manifest and live in the trees even sometimes. So these big tree trunks were turned facing the ritual site in perfect dimensional timing in the ritual, and two huge black-headed Draco dogs would manifest in the water. Now I can only describe these things as something like two ancient dragon dogs like you would see outside of a Chinese temple or restaurant, like bulldogs. And they had, like dragon dogs. They had huge heads and then these short, stumpy bodies. Like they weren't completely finished forming or something. And I don't know what part of hell they came out from, but they physically manifested. And then they came, because the supernatural manifests in the natural. And the kids were thrown into the water, whole, or with whatever was left of them that had been ripped up sometimes, usually bones even, from when Pax was standing at the fire, and he would throw the victims into the water to the water beasts when the tree roots opened up and they came out. And they would await there with their mouths open and their claws, just anticipating and gripping whatever was going to be thrown in the water for them that they could finish off. And this was a feeding hole in this bend of the river. And this was one of the hardest things for me to ever record and witness. And I actually went back to this river in amnesia of the events that happened here, and swam in a kayak by here, and then saw these astral faces of the Draco dogs that were still manifesting in the roots. They weren't physically manifesting now because we had shut it down, but I could see in the spirit their faces. And then I freaked out and I jumped out and was stuck on this rocky shore looking at the green trading wall and not realizing why my body was shaking or what psychosomatic reactions were happening. And then John had to assist in getting me back to normal because a big storm would come in, and I had an effect on, as Mother Echo of dimensions responding to what I was going through. So these Draco dogs would eat the bones. The River Creek Bend would turn red in this spot as the cult would go crazy. In these heightened moments of like demonic frenzy, they would all start speaking like these demonic languages, and the fires would provoke this evil display. And they just thought they were so high and mighty because that's all that it's all the power they can get is feeding off of this stuff. And you'd have to block out the noises to not let that evil in. So they gained power from these rites, and what happened after I was picked up by Pax's hands and repelled myself out of his grip was that I kind of like threw myself in the air backwards and then thrown into the water. But I was supernaturally protected in the water from not getting ripped up by the Draco dogs. And there was already a big storm that was raging close, and it broke and split in that second. And then we had help from our ship in this event from up high, but ultimately all victory here happened because Heavenly Host intervened into the situation. And Archangel Salafiel showed up, and this angel protects children. And I thought it was going to be the angel of the region or the state showing up, but instead I was surprised, and then I grew a fondness of this angel. And he came from the woods with he had a large white fiery javelin, and he split the edge of the concrete slab mock temple corner with this huge rumbling crack, and the whole thing split. And he actually took us in time and showed us exactly what he was going to do, and that they weren't going to eat us. So the whole side of their foundational Mayan temple structure shattered. It got split into like 3 huge pieces, and it shook the ground like an earthquake. And then the heavens shook too. It was that powerful, and it split in 3 ways, smashing packs, because he fell down into it between the edges of a triangle formation. Ironically, it just wedged himself in, and he got smashed by his own idea of a triangle itself in the ground. So this guy had these lightnings, rumblings, and the Draco water dogs were cut in half at that exact moment too. So their bodies shriveled in the water like little legs dissolving by holy fire, and they looked like little leg bones floating in the water afterwards. Like they'd just been like discombobulated and taken out of commission. So their decapitated heads were bobbing around the water, and also burned up where the angelic weapons from heaven had touched that water, and the water was already starting to be cleansed from the black and the red deep pool that it was. That was also a portal to hell. So those voices were silenced, the voices of those hordes of hell, the demons that were there, and the frenzy, and justice was served there. Their heads dissolved back into the tree stump roots that were like openings, like doors that they would go in and out of. And then the tree stumps just laid there like these gaping mouths that were dead. And they're still there, they're just like holding an image of the dog heads, but it's in the astral. But the actual physical manifestations weren't allowed to come through anymore, and that was gone. So nature is a retainer for many things, and the Stoichian elementals, they have a choice to serve Jehovah or not. And the remaining cult members were paralyzed in the blinding light of these events that transpired, and the lightnings, the thunders, the rumblings. And the remaining ones driving the trucks that were running people over and doing the kidnappings and bringing the victims here to this site. These were recon missions that were run, and all of those people were dealt with and prosecuted by secret military courts. Thank God. Salafiel does these kinds of assignments on a daily basis, and the NSA knows about the angelic warfare and the Joshua generation, and even they keep track of hybrids or angelic humans or all the different weird things that go on Earth. But Salafiel was a wonderful angel. He escorts the martyrs in situations like this, or innocents, to the highest courts in heaven, where they meet their Creator with loving open arms. And they don't have a spirit of pain to haunt them anymore, or bother them, or echo anything back to them ever again. So his service was highly appreciated and recognized by the secret space program. Salutations. And high justice is only served by the throne room and by the angels, not so much by the courts of man on Earth. So there was still some marine spirit activity, especially after the Mothman events, and this area had a lot of things happen still. Like a couple ended up buying a piece of land on the river where there was SRA site activity, and this land was tied with soul ties and evil land deeds and titles and liens and stuff. God never intended them to have this land, and getting this stuff cleared with wise decisions. This wasn't well known in 1976, and being able to petition the Lord and the courts of heaven and other things that involve kingdom authority and territories, regions, and other things that go on with spiritual warfare. So this couple bought this land. They exchanged dollars with an actual demon that they thought was a human. And what happened is immediately their truck was lifted up and thrown down the hill by a water spirit because of that agreement and contract signing. And their blue truck, it was stuck in a tree upside down facing the river, and then a tree ended up growing out of it on the riverbank. So that water spirit was demonstrating, like displaying his ownership and territorial domain over this river. Because when you have sacrificial areas like this, you're always going to deal with these types of domain and the spirit there. So he would do that to anyone or anything that came through there tried to kick him out. So he was finally driven out, and the land in that plot of the river no longer has any SRA activity, and a lot of parts of this are actually owned by the state now that mark it as state property. And then the phantom anomalies that would pop up, they eventually quiet down, but a lot of this stuff is not well known and it gets covered up, but it's still a problem on Earth. But at least through different Black Ops groups, we made a big dent in it, because it could have been a lot worse. And whole countries could have been taken over by this. So the trails back there became like a little maze of lush and dead green trails, and the tree roots in one area got infected, and this circle of trees actually had all their roots split open and then surface and become infected with these black pools of black goo. We've also seen blood come out of trees. We've seen all sorts of things, and other trees were thrown around and pulled up by their roots and scattered through the creek beds. And some places just look like havoc, and tornadoes have been through there, even if a tornado has never touched the area. And a few small clearings can shed light and life in certain places, but for the most part, these woods are like overgrown with portal breaches over time, so all those spiritual doors have to be closed. And the giant black snake, that thing was cut up and petrified, and the orange reptilians in the brush that had night hunts. The bushes had underwater tunnels for Dracos that they would release at night. There was actually hundreds of them through storm sewer openings. All those files got closed. And then we also had some interesting places where we'd meet things like Shiva, or which carries like a dust and a dirt from hell that they want people to smear on their faces. All these fake little gods, G-gods. Shiva and other marine entities manifested in a church one time. And lightning had struck this church before, and it was at the site of an old, like, 1800s mill. And Shiva manifested in the entryway of the chapel of this place, and was like a blue, 15-foot tall, sitting Shiva, blue blood, disgusting marine demigod with like bloodshot eyes, bloodthirsty eyes that are also black, and then it was holding a weapon in its hand with symbols on its forehead, but it's like blue and puke green aura was infecting the room in waves where this thing sat. And he seemed to be like stone-like, with only his eyes being able to move when he was looked at and rebuked and dealt with. And these things also bring like cold swirls around your feet. And the reason why these things happen is because leaderships of churches and places, they deny true heavenly things, and then so they give legal rights for these things to come in. They embrace the false instead of embracing the truth. Like a psychic would be able to set up shop next to a church, because that church and that group of people would probably deny the prophetic, and then they'd have legal rights over them to have the false. So God hands us over to our own devices when we don't listen, and then we learn hard lessons from it. So he's a good parent that teaches us. So these things like blanket and blind the minds of people there, and you can sense it as a spiritual odor, and tune in your senses to that. There's also a werewolf nearby in another place, another church, where werewolf hair was actually left, a big gob of werewolf hair on the red crimson seat pews. That's a whole other event. So the Jesuits were also involved with this whole ring, trapping, kidnapping. They actually brought kids once to a green daycare facility, stealing them out of time, and having these kids had to overcome this very odd adventure. This place was set up as a front, as a sensory art therapy type place, and there was broken upside down peace signs and symbols all over it, and it was black and green paint everywhere. And this place was a place to contain and supervise time jumpers and other special children, but the facility and this trick didn't work, and it ended up backfiring on them, and the kids jumped out of their bodies and were reunited with their full selves. And next door to this was an Italian place where there was an Italy gate, and there was Vatican operations going on, and it connected actually to a portal on a stone wall in Italy that looked like an eye that they would use to access different parts. So they know how to split you up, like in soul, spirit parts, and then send those different parts to different places. It's like tormenting a soul matrix. But if you have I don't know, that fortification in God, you'll learn to become whole, and He'll teach you how to become whole, and to not be fooled so easily, and to not be ignorant of the devil's devices, and gain all your parts back. And they do this fragmenting and splitting to cause confusion, aberrations, psyche damage when all this stuff happens, and to keep you in like a continual cubicle and identity crisis. So the only anchor back to the full healing of the soul, body, mind, spirit, and strength is that rock, Yahushua Mashiach, when we're rooted and grounded in His love and growing in His faith. So there's another Jesuit community that was totally gated, and this area became known as the Emerald Quadrant. And the facility was a mortuary, and we called one guy there an Eggman, and another guy a hairy wolf-looking unibrow sporting man. And they were actually survivors themselves, but we didn't quite trust them either. So this is the Luca file that just came out in Disney. There was a boy that was in there in this huge stand-up cylindrical tank that was not a fish tank. This was for a hybrid, and he was still alive. So back then I actually went up to this tank and I looked at him in this green tank, and he was forming features like ears and stuff that would be marine in nature, but you could tell that that boy Luca was still in there. And I had never seen that close, face-to-face living parts of a child still stirring and suspended quite like this before. That was still looking out at you with his eyes, but yet imprisoned, standing upright and floating in a watery prison with webs forming around his fingers and toes and ears. But he was crying out for help, and you could tell that he was still in there, and he was still savable. So this was a crime that broke my heart for this boy who didn't want to be hybridized. And we eventually rescued him, and by the grace of God, he's still alive today and healed from the full transmogrification that they wanted to happen to him. And we called this Operation Green Lawn in the Green Village, next to a spot where hundreds of clones were kept and gunned down and buried in front of razor wire fences at a Blackman site facility, which is also near an X-Men surgical facility, Holding Medical Research Center, now turned recreation public use facility. And then this place was also by a Catholic private school where 007 boys were for a while, and a small group of them. And this place had an evil, ancient Irish fighting spirit there that we contended with, and a portal from Springfield, Missouri to Springfield, Ohio that connected two Jesuit schools. So not everyone knows this is happening sometimes, that there's just a few sorcerers embedded into a group of people that seem legitimate, and they use Saturnian magic and inversion principles to funnel timelines into their wanted and desired false futures, and the portal tech and the time gates. And these boys were, and this is why some of the boys didn't remember what building they were in, because one of the buildings had benches in one spring field and the other building didn't, in the rooms that they would go back and forth to. So the boys would be sitting upstairs on benches in front of green windows on the second story, and then the electrical towers that were right next to this building would start emitting certain frequencies and algorithms to make these boys' heads start dropping down. Like their heads would start bobbing up and down, like their bodies were being taken over. So some boys that went through this would end up jumping out the window when this happened, like, because some committed suicide and jumped out the window when their minds and bodies were taken over. And it was like a mind control assisted and driven suicide to targeted individuals that they wanted to take out in time, even if they were clone bodies. That's how much the Jesuits hated the super soldier kids that were doing so much good for this planet. And some of the kids who were strong enough didn't allow their heads to start falling down. They could fight the sleep tech and all the other things that they would be accosted with. And they had this supernatural ability to fast track into a hyperspace corridor, kind of like a Flash type of situation. And then that would determine an optimal outline of the jump on a quantum level with a high percentage of survival probability and a recurve of getting back to their original point in time or their original body at some point. So sometimes it meant jumping and hopping with the black sorcerer